Somewhere in the world right now, a man is fixing a leaky pipe under someone's kitchen sink, covered in grease, wearing rubber gloves. And in 3 months, he will be standing on a World Cup pitch in front of 60,000 screaming fans, representing his entire nation on the biggest stage football has ever seen. That is not a joke, that is not a movie plot, and that is absolutely not an exaggeration. Because the 2026 World Cup, with its expanded 48-team format, has opened the door for players whose lives look nothing like the glamorous, private jet, Ballon d'Or lifestyle we normally associate with this tournament. And today, we are going to meet some of them. When FIFA decided to expand the World Cup from 32 to 48 teams for 2026, the football world had a very predictable reaction. Half of it celebrated the inclusivity, and the other half immediately started panicking about the quality gap between the elite nations and the newer qualifiers. But here is the thing that neither side fully appreciated at the time. This expansion didn't just add 16 more countries to a tournament, it added 16 more stories, 16 more cultures, 16 more sets of players who come from football ecosystems so different from the Premier League or La Liga that they might as well be playing a completely different sport in a completely different universe. In many of the smaller nations that qualified for 2026, professional football, as we understand it, simply does not exist. There are no weekly wages, no boot deals, no training centers with recovery pools and nutritionists, and there are certainly no agents negotiating 7-figure contracts. There is just a man who loves football, who is good enough at football to be selected for his national team, and who also has a mortgage, a family, and a boss who may or may not give him 2 weeks off to go play in North America. Let's start with a story that almost sounds like the setup to a comedy sketch, except it is entirely real. Several players from Oceania and smaller Caribbean nations who qualified through the expanded CONCACAF and OFC pathways maintain full-time or part-time trade jobs back home because the domestic football leagues in their countries either pay close to nothing or don't pay at all, and a man with a family cannot survive on prestige alone. There have been documented cases of national team players in the Pacific Islands who returned from international duty, changed out of their kit, and went straight back to their construction jobs the following Monday morning, because the alternative was simply not paying rent. When journalists ask these players about the disconnect between their two worlds, the answers are almost always the same. They don't see it as a disconnect at all. They see football as something they do because they love it, and work as something they do because life requires it. And they have never once been told they had to choose between the two. The romantic ideal of the full-time professional athlete simply doesn't apply to them, and somehow that makes their journey to a World Cup even more extraordinary than the player who has been in an academy since age 9 and has never known anything else. Then there are the educators, and yes, that is exactly what it sounds like. There are World Cup players who teach school children during the week and then pull on their national jersey on the weekend. And the children in their classroom have absolutely no idea that their math teacher or their PE instructor is about to compete in the most watched sporting event on the planet. In countries like the Comoros Islands, Mauritania, or some of the smaller Pacific nations, teaching is one of the most stable and respected careers a person can have. And football, even at the national team level, simply does not pay enough to justify walking away from that stability. There is something deeply human about a man standing in front of a chalkboard on a Tuesday afternoon, explaining fractions, or the water cycle, while mentally preparing for the fact that in 6 weeks he will be defending against some of the fastest strikers on Earth. When these players eventually do make it to the World Cup, their students watch from home with a kind of pride that no amount of money can manufacture. Because this isn't a distant celebrity they've seen on a billboard. This is their teacher, someone who graded their homework, someone who told them to stop talking during class. And now, he is on the same pitch as players worth $100 million. That contrast, that impossible gap between the ordinary and the extraordinary existing inside the same human being, is something you will never find in a story about Kylian Mbappé or Erling Haaland. And it is the kind of story that makes football genuinely irreplaceable as a global phenomenon.
But perhaps the most cinematic image of all,
And the one that has appeared in multiple documentaries about football in the developing world, is the fisherman who plays football. In the coastal communities of West Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Islands, fishing is not a hobby. It is the economic backbone of entire communities, and it is not uncommon for players who represent their nations internationally to spend their off-seasons and sometimes their in-seasons working on boats, hauling nets, waking before sunrise to do the kind of physical labor that most professional athletes are specifically told to avoid for fear of injury. And yet, these players arrive at international training camps with a kind of raw, physical conditioning that their coaches genuinely cannot explain. Because it wasn't built in a gym with a periodization plan. It was built by years of pulling ropes, carrying loads, and working in the kind of heat and humidity that makes a normal pre-season look like a gentle stroll. There is a famous story, repeated often enough that it has taken on almost mythological status in football circles, of a Pacific Islands player who had to be contacted by his national federation via a family member because he was out at sea with no phone signal when the squad announcement was made. And when he finally came back to shore, he learned he had been selected for an international tournament the same way he would learn any other piece of news, from someone standing on the dock waiting for him to tie up the boat. It would be very easy to frame all of this as inspiration porn, to take these stories and package them into a neat narrative about underdogs and hard work and the beautiful game transcending all barriers, and then move on without actually sitting with what these stories are really telling us. Because what they are really telling us is that the global football economy is so grotesquely unequal that the same tournament, which will pay some clubs hundreds of millions in player release fees, is simultaneously sending players to compete who will come home to the same second job, the same modest apartment, and the same Tuesday morning routine that existed before anyone cared who they were. The 2026 World Cup, expanding to 48 teams, did not fix that inequality. It simply made it more visible, which is either progress or irony, depending on your perspective. These players are not competing despite their circumstances. They are competing with their circumstances fully intact, carrying the weight of a life that football didn't save them from, but simply added an extraordinary chapter to. And that distinction matters enormously if you want to understand what football actually means outside of the top 5 European leagues. So the next time you are watching the 2026 World Cup and a small nation you barely recognize takes the field against one of the giants, and their goalkeeper makes a save that nobody expected, or their striker hits a shot that sends an entire country into hysteria back home, Take a moment to wonder what that player's life actually looks like when the tournament is over and the cameras go home. Because there is a very real chance that the answer involves an early alarm clock, a uniform that has nothing to do with football, and a completely ordinary day that follows the most extraordinary experience of his life. And if that doesn't make you feel something about this sport, then honestly, nothing will. Subscribe if you want more stories like this, because football is a lot bigger and a lot stranger and a lot more human than the highlights ever show you.